I want to welcome you all to the final session before we start the month of Ramadan. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to meet the month of Ramadan, the month of forgiveness and mercy, with open hearts and with acceptance. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that it also be a month of relief for our brothers and sisters in Gaza and all over the world. Allahumma ameen. So I wanted to do something special tonight, to depart a bit from the typical weekly class that we do on the biographies of the companions of the first. And I wanted to address the historical background of Ramadan as it relates to some of the most historical triumphs and trials that our community has ever faced, that the Ummah has ever faced. So basically studying the famous incidents that took place in this month of Ramadan as they pertain to great victory and to great loss. And I think that one of the reasons why this becomes so important to us is that obviously with Gaza happening in the background, there's a depressed mood within the community, a sense of despair that is overtaking many, and it's hard to contextualize all of that in the history of our ummah. And I think inshallah ta'ala tonight will be a great help as we go through some of those incidents. So I actually took about 10 or 12 incidents. I don't intend to take more than 35, 40 minutes inshallah ta'ala, just doing an overview of what Ramadan has looked like throughout Islamic history, particularly in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it's a month that is distinguished obviously by its worship. It's a month that's distinguished by our sense of discipline, and it's also a month that is distinguished by victory. And so some of the greatest triumphs in Islamic history have in fact come during this particular month of Ramadan. And so I want to start off with the following. There's the month of Ramadan as it relates to personal trial and tribulation, and there's the month of Ramadan as it relates to community victory. And so those two things are important to distinguish from one another. This is a month in which we see many of the most difficult days of the Prophet ﷺ at a personal level. But it's also a month in which we see some of our greatest moments and greatest moments of hope, particularly in his era, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I also want to make one other, I think, distinguishing fact. There's a difference between Ramadan before fasting was legislated and Ramadan prior to that. Now, Allah has made it as such that blessed days coincide with blessed incidents and important and significant moments in our history, even before those days are honored by acts of worship. So for example, the first 10 days of the Hijjah, right? They're also known as the 10 days of Moses, the 10 days of Musa alayhi salam, when he went up to speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he received the commandments. So those 10 days coincide with the 10 days of the Hijjah, coincide with the days of Ibrahim, coincide with the days of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they coincide naturally by the divine scheme. Likewise, when it comes to the revelation of the books, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam talking about the descent of the Torah, the descent of the Gospels, the descent of the Psalms, the Zabur, all in the month of Ramadan, coinciding with the month of Ramadan, even if people did not know them to be descending in the month of Ramadan. And so many things happened before the legislation of fasting the month of Ramadan. When did the legislation of fasting of Ramadan come? What year was it? Who can tell me? Did voting exhaust you all that much? Like, you're all so tired. It's a quick line today. Why does everyone look so exhausted? What year was it legislated? The second year after Hijrah. The second year after Hijrah, kutiba alaykum as-siyam. Fasting was prescribed upon you. However, before fasting is prescribed in the month of Ramadan, the Prophet ﷺ obviously received revelation in the month of Ramadan, in which he went to his wife Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha, and she grasped him sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she embraced him as he was shook by the experience of receiving revelation. But it's also the month that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam buried Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha. So Khadija passed away radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on the 10th day of Ramadan before the legislation of fasting in Ramadan. And this is of course one of the most difficult moments of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, if not his most difficult moment, when he goes into the grave to receive the body of Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha, his emotional support, his loving wife who stood by him every step of the way in the face of that persecution. And then his uncle Abu Talib, within days, passes away also in the month of Ramadan. And the Prophet ﷺ has to deal with the heartbreak of everything that surrounded the death of Abu Talib, and Abu Talib being the physical protection of the Prophet ﷺ, no longer there to protect him from his enemies. And of course, that was the year of grief, Am al-Huzn, where the Prophet ﷺ was also humiliated and persecuted and beaten by the people of Ta'if. So this took place, personal losses took place in the month of Ramadan, and these were the most devastating losses in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. But of course, with those devastating losses comes a realization of a new spiritual rank. And that is in fact how we view divine decree, how we view qadar in Islam, that with the most difficult test comes the most exemplary patience, and with the most exemplary patience comes the greatest reward. And so by saying that these were the moments that the Prophet ﷺ had his most difficult tests, you're also saying that these were the moments in which the Prophet ﷺ realized his greatest rewards in this blessed month of Ramadan. It's also the month in which, for example, on a personal level, again, and of course this has a community element as well, Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu ta'ala anhu was martyred on the 17th day of Ramadan, 40 years after Hijrah in Kufa. May Allah be pleased with him. Amir al-Mu'mineen. Tragic, right? He prayed Salatul Fajr and he was killed by the Khawarij on that day of Ramadan. But again, if you were to ask Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu about being martyred on a day of Ramadan after Salatul Fajr, then that is a realization of a different spiritual rank for him as well. And that is the hope and the optimism of the believer as they combine tragedy with understanding of the afterlife, right? And those two things go together. Now when we move into the actual post-Ramadan victories and battles and triumphs, the Prophet ﷺ receives the command 2 years after Hijrah, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامِ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. Fasting has been prescribed upon you as it was prescribed on those who came before you, so that you may become God conscious. So the command to fast is in the month of Ramadan, Shahru Ramadan, and it was also in the 2nd year after Hijrah that Allah reveals, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالِ وَهُوَ كُرْهٌ لَكُمْ.